My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 45 years old, and for most of my life I believed that if you followed the rules, worked hard, treated people with respect, things usually worked themselves out. Maybe not quickly, maybe not perfectly, but eventually fairness caught up. That's what I believed. Right up until the afternoon, I stood 20 feet away from my 12-year-old daughter while she cried her eyes out, unscrewing the windows from the treehouse she'd spent an entire summer building, because the president of our HOA wanted to teach her a lesson about obedience. She didn't destroy a structure that day. She destroyed a little girl's confidence. And the moment you fight, Mashti Balai Feeve with dusty hands while a grown woman stood there smiling with her arms folded, something inside me changed forever. We had moved to Cedar Ridge, a quiet neighborhood outside Franklin, Tennessee, almost 7 years earlier. It wasn't fancy, just one of those communities where people waved when they walked their dogs, borrowed ladders from each other, and complained about the weather more than politics. My wife, Melissa, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school nearby, and I worked as a structural engineer designing commercial buildings. Numbers made sense to me. Load calculations made sense. Steel beams made sense. People, not always. Our daughter Lily had always been different from other kids. Not in a bad way, just quieter. While most children spent afternoons glued to video games, Lily carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. She drew birds, old barns, people's faces in coffee shops, even our old Labrador sleeping on the porch. Her grandfather, my dad Walter, noticed that passion before anyone else did. The two of them spent every Saturday together in his garage building little things, birdhouses, shells, tiny bridges over our backyard creek. Then one June afternoon, Dad looked at the enormous white oak behind our house and smiled. "You know," he said, "this tree has been waiting 50 years for somebody to give it a purpose." Lily's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. For the next 6 weeks, that backyard became our world. Dad taught her how to measure twice before cutting once. I calculated every load, every support beam, every bolt. We filed for the city permit because that's what responsible people do. The inspector came out, checked everything, complimented the design, signed the paperwork, and wished Lily luck with her art studio in the sky. That's exactly what it became. It wasn't some rickety treehouse with a rope ladder. It had insulated walls, skylights, proper railings, a small desk under the window where morning sunlight landed perfectly, and shelves filled with paintbrushes and canvases. Lily called it the nest. By August, she'd started posting paintings online, nothing fancy, mostly landscapes and pet portraits, but somehow people loved them. She sold enough artwork that summer to earn almost $3,000, not because she needed the money, but because every sale made her believe her dream mattered. Every evening she'd climb down that ladder grinning, holding another order she printed from the family computer. I'd never seen her so confident. Then, on a Monday morning in early September, an envelope appeared on our front porch. Bright yellow, certified mail. The return address belonged to the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I honestly thought it was about annual dues until I opened it. According to the letter, our tree studio violated the architectural standards because any backyard structure taller than 4 feet required HOA design approval, regardless of city permits. We had 10 days to remove it or face daily fines of $200. I actually laughed at first. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. So I called the HOA office and politely explained that we'd already gone through the city, obtained permits, passed inspections, and engineered the entire structure professionally. The receptionist simply said, "Mrs. Cynthia Holloway would be happy to discuss it at Thursday's board meeting." Cynthia Holloway. I already knew the name. Everyone did. She had been HOA president for almost 9 years, a successful corporate attorney with perfect hair, perfect clothes, and a personality polished smooth enough that you couldn't grab onto anything real. She smiled constantly, but somehow it never reached her eyes. At Thursday's meeting, I brought copies of the permits, engineering drawings, inspection reports, photographs, probably more paperwork than anyone had ever brought to an HOA meeting. Cynthia barely looked at any of it. She adjusted her glasses, slid the folder back toward me, and said, "Mr. Carter, this isn't about safety. It's about compliance." I tried keeping my voice calm. "Compliance with what exactly?" "The city approved it." She smiled. "The city doesn't govern Cedar Ridge. We do." A few homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older gentleman quietly muttered that the structure looked beautiful. Cynthia ignored him completely, Remove it within 10 days, she continued. Or the fines begin automatically. Can I apply for retroactive approval? I asked. She didn't even pretend to think about it. No. Can I request a hearing? Denied. Can I at least understand why? That's when her smile disappeared for the first time. Because rules only matter if people learn there are consequences. I drove home furious, but I still believed common sense would eventually win. Melissa told me not to worry. Dad said we'd figure it out. Lily overheard enough to ask one question that broke my heart. Daddy, did I do something wrong? I hugged her and told her absolutely not. I wish that had been true, because 30 days later, after $6,000 in fines had piled up, Cynthia Holloway pulled into our driveway with 2 board members and a county code officer, and what happened next would become the biggest mistake she ever made. I remember every second of that morning because my brain refuses to let me forget it. The sound of car doors closing outside. My father quietly setting his coffee mug on the kitchen counter without taking another sip. Melissa grabbing my arm before I walked toward the front door, whispering, "Please don't let them bait you." Then Lily looked through the living room window and asked, almost excited at first, "Dad, are they finally here to approve it?" I couldn't answer. Cynthia Holloway stepped out first, dressed like she was walking into a board meeting instead of someone's backyard. Navy blazer, white slacks, clipboard tucked under one arm, sunglasses hiding whatever she was thinking. Behind her came 2 HOA board members who suddenly seemed very interested in the grass beneath their shoes, and finally a county code officer who looked confused before he'd even spoken a word. I greeted them politely, because that's who I was back then. Cynthia didn't bother returning the courtesy. "Mr. Carter," she announced loudly enough for 3 neighboring houses to hear, "your compliance period has expired." I handed the county officer copies of our permits before anyone else spoke. He scanned them, frowned, then looked back at Cynthia. "From what I can tell," he said carefully, "the county has no issue with this structure." Cynthia smiled without missing a beat. "We're not here under county authority. We're here under HOA covenanters." The officer shrugged as if to say, "This isn't really my fight," and stepped back. That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have realized there was no public safety concern. Instead, Cynthia turned toward Lily, who had quietly walked onto the back porch holding the sketchbook she'd carried almost every day that summer. Cynthia pointed toward the treehouse and said words I'll probably remember on my deathbed. "Young lady, sometimes adults make mistakes. Today, you'll learn that rules exist for everyone." Lily looked at me, completely confused. "What does that mean?" Cynthia answered before I could. "It means if your father won't remove the structure, you'll help him." Melissa immediately stepped between them. "Absolutely not." Cynthia never even looked at my wife. She kept her eyes locked on my daughter. "Actions have consequences." My father finally spoke, his voice calmer than mine could have been. "Ma'am, she's a child." Cynthia replied, "Then she'll learn early." I wanted to scream. Every instinct told me to tell everyone to get off my property. But my attorney had already warned me the previous week that if I physically interfered after receiving multiple violation notices, they'd try to paint me as the unreasonable homeowner. Cameras tell stories. He had said, "Make sure yours tells the right one." So I did the hardest thing I'd ever done. I walked into the garage, grabbed my phone, mounted it on a tripod overlooking the backyard, hit record, and prayed I would never need the footage. Lily climbed the ladder slowly. Every step sounded heavier than the one before it. Dad climbed behind her because there was no way he was letting her work alone. She reached the little wooden door she painted light blue with tiny white clouds across the top. She touched it for several seconds before opening it. "Grandpa," she whispered, "do I have to?" He looked down toward me. I couldn't speak. I simply nodded once. That memory still haunts me. For the next 5 hours, my daughter dismantled the place where she discovered who she wanted to become. First came the flower boxes she'd built from leftover cedar, then the skylight we had installed together one hot July afternoon. Every screw she removed sounded louder than the last. She cried quietly at first, then openly, then not at all because eventually you run out of tears. Cynthia never left. She stood there with crossed arms, occasionally checking items off her clipboard like she was supervising a roofing project instead of watching a child's heart break. At one point, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, walked over carrying lemonade because she'd heard the commotion. She took one look at Lily and immediately started crying herself. "Cynthia," she pleaded. "This isn't necessary," Cynthia replied without emotion. Standards require consistency. Mrs. Alvarez looked at me and whispered, "This isn't consistency. This is cruelty." By sunset, the tree stood empty again. Just bare branches where dreams had lived that morning. Lily walked straight past everyone, carrying one paintbrush she'd forgotten inside. She didn't say a single word. She went into her room, closed the door, and for the first time since she was 5 years old, she locked it. The next morning, the backyard felt wrong. Too quiet, too clean. I kept expecting to hear music drifting down from the tree or smell fresh paint whenever I opened the kitchen window. Instead, there was nothing. Days turned into weeks. Lily stopped drawing. Art supplies collected dust. Customers emailed asking whether she'd be posting new paintings soon. She never answered them. One evening, I found an unopened package sitting beside the front door. It contained professional watercolor paper she'd saved 3 months to buy with her own earnings. She looked at it for a second and said softly, "Maybe somebody else can use it." That sentence hurt more than every fine Cynthia had ever mailed us. Melissa blamed herself because she couldn't protect our daughter. Dad blamed himself because building the studio had been his idea. I blame myself because I'd believed fairness happened automatically. It doesn't. Sometimes fairness has to be built. The same way we built that treehouse, one beam at a time. About 3 weeks later, my attorney, Daniel Pierce, came over for dinner instead of meeting in his office. Halfway through dessert, he looked around the table and quietly asked Lily whether she'd ever paint again. She shrugged. Probably not. Daniel didn't say anything else until after she went upstairs. Then he leaned toward me and asked a question that completely changed the direction of the case. "Ethan, have you ever looked into every approval this HOA has granted?" I frowned. "Why?" He smiled the way good trial lawyers smile when they smell smoke before anyone else notices the fire. "Because selective enforcement cases are rarely about the rule. They're about who gets exempted from the rule." The next morning, I filed a records request. The HOA had no legal choice except to provide architectural approval records because homeowners had inspection rights under the governing documents. It took nearly 3 weeks before 6 heavy archive boxes landed in my garage. Melissa joked that Cynthia probably hoped the paperwork alone would scare me away. She underestimated one important detail. Engineers actually enjoy sorting data. Every evening after work, I spread files across folding tables. I built spreadsheets, cross-reference addresses, compared approvals with aerial photographs, pulled county tax records, measured visible structures using archived satellite imagery. Dad helped organize permits while Melissa highlighted missing signatures. It became less like legal research and more like solving a giant puzzle. 3 nights later, I found the first one. A gazebo almost 9 feet tall, no architectural approval. The next file revealed a pergola nearly 11 feet high, approved after construction. Then a detached pool house, then decorative towers, then oversized sheds. Every discovery made my pulse beat faster. By the end of the second week, I had documented 71 violations nearly identical to ours. 60 of those properties had never received a single fine. 48 belonged to people who had publicly supported Cynthia during HOA elections. 1 belonged to her brother-in-law. Another belonged to her closest friend. Then I reached Cynthia's own application history. There wasn't one. She had installed an elaborate garden pavilion years earlier without submitting a single approval form. I stared at the file for almost a full minute before laughing out loud for the first time in months. Melissa looked up from another stack of documents. "What?" I turned the folder around slowly. She never followed her own rule. Daniel arrived the following morning. We spread everything across my dining room table. He looked at the evidence, removed his glasses, and smiled. "Ethan, I think your case just stopped being about a treehouse." I asked him what he meant. He tapped one document after another. "This is a pattern. If we can prove motive, this board is in serious trouble." None of us knew then that the biggest piece of evidence wasn't hiding in permits, or inspection reports, or violation letters. It was sitting inside Cynthia Holloway's own inbox, waiting for a judge to order every single email turned over during discovery. Discovery took another 6 weeks. And, if you've never been through a lawsuit, let me tell you something. Movies make it look exciting, but most of it is waiting, reading, waiting some more, and wondering if the truth is ever going to matter. Then one Thursday afternoon, Daniel called and said only 4 words before hanging up. "Get to my office." I knew from his voice something had changed. When I walked in, he had a laptop open with hundreds of printed emails stacked beside it. He didn't smile immediately. Instead, he slid one page across the desk and let me read it myself. It was an email Cynthia had sent to 2 board members almost a year before she ever mailed us that first violation notice. The subject line was simple: Carter property. The sentence underneath wasn't: he's been undermining this board since the last election. It's time the Carter family learns that nobody embarrasses this association without consequences. I read it twice because I honestly couldn't believe someone would put something that reckless in writing. Daniel slid another email over. This one discussed our tree studio after she'd already seen the city permit. One board member had written, "Technically, they're compliant with county requirements. Should we just approve it retroactively?" Cynthia's response was one sentence: "Absolutely not. Make an example out of them." I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the ceiling. For months I'd wondered if I was overreacting. If maybe this really had been about architectural standards. It wasn't. It never had been. She had picked my family because I voted against her during the previous HOA election after questioning several budget decisions. My daughter had simply become the easiest way to punish me. The trial itself lasted 4 days. Cynthia walked into court carrying herself with the same confidence she'd shown in my backyard. She testified that every decision had been objective, fair, and consistent. Then Daniel began displaying photographs, one after another. Gazebos, pergolas, pool houses, garden pavilions, structures far larger than Lily's studio. No fines, no removal orders, no hearings denied. Then came the emails. You could actually hear people shifting in their seats inside the courtroom. Cynthia stopped making eye contact with the jury. Finally, Daniel asked the judge to play one final piece of evidence: the video from my backyard. I'd only watched it once since recording it. I never wanted to see it again. But there it was on the courtroom screen. Lily carefully removing the little blue door she painted herself, my father helping her lower each window, Melissa quietly crying behind the camera, and Cynthia standing 20 feet away with folded arms while my daughter asked, "Daddy, if I build it better next time, can I keep it?" You could hear my voice crack when I answered, "We'll build it again someday." The courtroom stayed completely silent after the video ended. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment. The judge removed his glasses, looked directly at Cynthia, and said, "Authority exists to serve a community, not to settle personal scores." His ruling was thorough, and honestly, more satisfying than I ever imagined. The court found that the HOA had engaged in intentional, selective enforcement, acted in bad faith, violated its own governing procedures, and caused measurable emotional harm through discriminatory conduct. We were awarded $360,000 in damages, and the HOA was ordered to pay every dollar of our legal fees. But strangely enough, the money wasn't the part that meant the most to me. 2 weeks later, homeowners started knocking on our door. People I'd barely spoken to before admitted they'd been afraid to challenge Cynthia for years. One family confessed they'd removed a wheelchair ramp because they feared retaliation. Another said they'd canceled a greenhouse project after receiving threatening letters. They weren't asking me for revenge. They were asking me to help make sure this never happened again. Within a month, enough homeowners had signed a recall petition to remove Cynthia and 2 board members. During the next election, several neighbors encouraged me to run for HOA president. I laughed at first because it sounded like the last job on earth I'd ever want. Then Lily surprised me. She looked up from the first sketch she'd drawn in nearly 4 months and said, "Maybe good people should be in charge sometimes." That was all the convincing I needed. I won the election by the largest margin in our neighborhood's history. My first board meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. We eliminated the outdated height restriction, created a transparent architectural review process with published decisions, guaranteed homeowners the right to appeal, and required every approval or denial to include written justification. Funny thing about fairness, it isn't actually that complicated once people stop chasing power. The following spring, my father and Lily started building again. This time the studio stood 12 feet high, stronger, brighter, and even more beautiful than the first one. We added larger windows, better lighting, and a small deck where she could sit beneath the branches with her paints. A few months later, we used part of the settlement money to build a community art pavilion in the neighborhood park where local kids could paint, sculpt, and learn together for free. It just so happened to sit directly across the street from Cynthia's former house. She sold the property before construction finished. Sometimes people ask whether I feel like I got even. Honestly, no. Getting even would have meant making someone else suffer the way my daughter did. That's not what happened. What happened was accountability. There's a difference. Lily paints professionally now. My father still stops by every Saturday with coffee and a tape measure, even when nothing needs fixing. And every time I look up at that tree, I remember the day I almost taught my daughter that bullies always win. I'm grateful she ended up learning something much more important instead. That rules should protect people, not control them. And when someone abuses power, standing up peacefully, patiently, and legally can change an entire community. So now I want to ask you, if you'd been standing in that backyard watching your own child forced to tear down something they loved, would you have handled it the same way I did? Or would you have done something completely different? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between following the rules and fighting for what's right. And if the story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that real justice sometimes takes patience, but it's always worth the fight.